So I was thinking about, actually I was trying to find a slide to put up for tonight's program just to introduce it, but I couldn't find it. In the fifth, and when my son was in the 5th grade, he's a sophomore in college now, he did a project and resulted in a poster on integrity, the concept of integrity. And I just remember that there were basically 4 things on that poster. And one was, follow through, keep your promises and do what you say you're going to do. And always do the right thing, no matter how hard it is. And then always, stick by your principles. But above all, be honest and abide by the truth, regardless of what your principles might be. So I think we can agree that whether your political views are on the right, the left, or in the middle, that this 5th graders' lesson on integrity, these values are important to our leadership. And it's interesting to note that science and integrity share the value of truth, right? Because science is basically looking to discover truth. We're trying to describe what's going on in our natural world, and the whole scientific process has integrity built into it through peer review, the process of discovering truth, and so forth. So being trained in science, I come to trust science if it's done properly. So I'm sort of beside myself observing what we see going on in the political landscape today. Because instead of our leadership relying on science to figure out what they should be doing and what policy should be, they're sidelining science and in favor of their own political self-interest. So if our leadership doesn't have the integrity to acknowledge and recognize truth and actually work according to truth, then it's really up to the constituents, right, to introduce integrity back into the process. And stand up for science during this age of denial, which is what our program is about tonight. So anyway, I want to bring Dr. Rosenberg up. He is director of the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. He's had about 25 years experience in government service and academic leadership, University of Massachusetts, University of New Hampshire, and he was also the Northeast Region Deputy Director for the National Marine Fisheries Service with NOAA. He was also the lead author of the Oceans chapter, not for this climate assessment that just came out, but the previous one. He's also a member of the National Academy of Sciences for Oceans, the Ocean Studies Board. But anyway, there's a whole nother page of things that he's done and accomplished that I won't go through because I think you'll find his presentation a whole lot more interesting. So, Dr. Rosenberg.
I think I just gave the summary of your talk, which is nice. And thank you for that. I lead a program called the Center for Science and Democracy, and I came to Union of Concerned Scientists 6.5 years ago as the inaugural director of that program. And so I've moved around quite a bit, as like indicated in my intro, and that either means I can't hold a job or I get very restless, and it's probably a little bit of both. But I came to UCS to lead this new program, and I had a lot of conversations that went something like this. Oh, science and democracy, that's really important. What are you going to do? Because I think it's important, but I don't know what you're going to do. And so I spent a few years trying to figure out what a Center for Science and Democracy should do and should look like. And it should talk about how scientific evidence comes into public policy. We work on some specific issues where science connects to public policy so people can see that connection. And then we work to have scientists and those who are interested and supportive of scientists more engaged in the public policy process. That sounded good to the Union of Concerned Scientists. That's what they hired me to do. That was all very interesting. And then we had an election, and nobody asked me, why do we need a Center for Science and Democracy? It used to be a standing joke for Union of Concerned Scientists, which has been around for 50 years, as of February, I think, that people would say, oh, Union of Concerned Scientists, what are you concerned about? And laugh. Nobody asks us that anymore. It's pretty obvious what we're concerned about. The organization was formed in 1969 because physicists at MIT and at Cornell were very concerned about the direction of the missile defense program and the Vietnam War. And they felt that in a university setting, they couldn't say some of the things they felt needed to be said. So they stepped out of the university to Kendall Square and started to talk about those issues directly. And from there, the organization built up to work on climate and energy, food and the environment, clean vehicles or clean transportation. And we continue to work on global security issues, as well as my program, the newest program, the Center for Science and Democracy, which is really about that connection of science into our overall democratic dialogue and public policy. So I'm really happy to be at UCS. I think it's a really good organization, and we were in a key position. We were in some ways prescient when the election happened and the Trump administration came in. Well, let's not make any mistake. Science is always viewed through a political lens. That's nothing new. Every administration has done it. The time that I worked at NOAA, certainly this was the case too. You had to look at the science through a political lens. That's the reality of the world we live in. But notice in the slide, science isn't changed by the politics. Science is just viewed through the politics. The evidence doesn't change. The evidence is the evidence. And I remember, arguing many times that we could make decisions for lots of different reasons, but we shouldn't try to force fit the science to justify any decision that we wanted to make. And Pat Kirkle had the exact same experience of, trying to make sure that at least you allowed the evidence to stay as it was. In other words, the evidence is what it is, with its uncertainties, with its issues, and so on. So here's a list of issues that, believe it or not, are in a vague way connected. Decisions about whether we will do any research using fetal tissue. Decision about whether you should have an expert panel of scientists advise the government on the health impacts of particulate matter or of ozone. The extent of protections that are needed under the Clean Water Act. The extent of requirements on coal-fired power plants to be addressed as those coal-fired power plants either make a decision to stay online or upgrade, so-called new source review. Decisions on fuel efficiency standards for cars. So those seem to be somewhat unconnected, and I can add quite a few more to the list. Sage-grouse protections in the western lands, opening of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. The reason I put together that list is those are issues of the connection of science and democracy that I've had to either speak about or strategize around in the last 2 weeks. It's a pretty long list. And every 2 weeks is like that, where there's a set of challenges coming forward of places where you would think that science would inform our decision making, but unfortunately it is not. The decision about fetal tissue research, of course there are societal concerns, but the decision about whether it's good research or not good research actually is informed by science. That's a science question. Decisions about particulate matter, yes, you should ask the questions from experts about what the health impacts are, and then make your public policy decisions about restricting particulate matter, and so on. But that's not actually what's happening in the government right now. So far, we have logged what we call 76 attacks on science. That is not 76 decisions that we disagreed with. It's 76 cases where science has been set aside on a major policy issue in one way or another by decisions in the last 2 years. There still are a significant number of top science positions vacant in all of the agencies. So this group is mostly focused on climate and climate change, but you need to understand that the pattern across the government is quite similar of not having qualified people leading the programs that heavily rely on science. That doesn't mean you have to have a scientist as managing every program, but it does mean that you need someone who knows how to manage a science program. It does mean that in some cases you do actually have to have a scientist. The chief scientist of the Department of Agriculture actually should be a scientist, you might think. partly because it is required by law. But the person who was nominated last year was not a scientist, had no scientific credentials. The same thing at other agencies. They're concerned about people who are leading science programs. In the White House, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which sort of takes this crosscut of the government on science and technology policy issues, was for some time, no longer fortunately, led by someone whose only qualification was having a degree in Hellenic studies, which I don't think is a field of science, but last time I checked. Now there is a very qualified scientist who's taken on the role of leading Office of Science and Technology Policy. So leadership is important. The science of climate change has been censored 14 times. Reports have been delayed. Conferences, people not allowed to attend conferences, including one in Rhode Island in Narragansett, where this was not a matter of money because they had to walk across the street to the conference, but they were not allowed to go and present research on Narragansett Bay. Advisory committees have been compromised by changing the membership of advisory committees, and I can talk about that in detail if somebody likes. It's actually a huge issue, but that includes the one on particulate matter and on ozone and the health effects of those emissions of both of those. Rushed research used to justify a policy, including a study of the tax changes, where the study of actually what the impact on the economy of the tax changes was prevented from being released, and another study rushed through that would actually justify the tax changes, even though the professionals in the Treasury Department disagreed with it. Again, something on science advisory boards and academy reports halted. The last one might seem a little bit strange, but the National Academy of Sciences, which is really the sort of premier body for science, was originally formed by President Lincoln. I'm not a member of the National Academy. I was a member of the Ocean Studies Board, but they do in-depth studies by high-level scientists on particular issues as tasked by the administration or Congress, and sometimes externally. I've never actually seen a study halted mid-course, but in this administration, they halted a study on the effect of mountaintop removal mining in Appalachia, which was actually called for by the states and communities in the coal mining region in Appalachia because of concerns about the impact of water quality. And that was coincident with them pushing through, actually Congress pushing through a rule to end the restrictions on mountaintop removal. So they halted the study because the evidence would have been inconvenient. They also halted a study on offshore oil rig safety that was commissioned following the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, which there were new requirements for safety gear on oil rigs. There was then a study of how effective those requirements had been. They halted that study in mid-course, so they were about 2 years into it, and instead withdrew the regulations requiring for external inspection on oil rigs and said that companies would self-inspect, which is what had happened before the Deepwater Horizon. But again, inconvenient report. So these are actual attacks on science. Whether you agree with any particular policy decision is not, it is something else again. Okay. So here's some examples of that. I mentioned dissolving an advisory panel on particulate matter and now ozone. Halting people attending a USGS's U.S. Geological Survey, whether scientists could present research at 2 major conferences. Most of that research related to climate change, but not all of it. Environmental and public health laws suspended for construction of the border wall. In other words, you don't have to go through an environmental review because it's a border wall. I'm not exactly sure why that means you don't have to go through an environmental and public health review, but apparently that's the case. DOE, Department of Energy, released a flawed report on the benefits of coal-fired power plants. The report was so flawed that a number of the scientists in the agency said, "You can't release this, that's just wrong." the numbers, the analysis is wrong. You can say you want to have coal-fired power plants, but you can't cook the numbers like that, but they did anyway. Department of Interior restricted science used in policy decision-making process on national monuments, and also on the use of public lands, and now increasingly around ANWR, opening the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. There was a federal database that was basically closed down on using best medical guidelines, because apparently we don't need to have best medical guidelines and to track them. There also is a changed requirement that you, for worker accidents, that you no longer have to keep the records longer than 2 years, because apparently if an accident is 2 years old, it doesn't matter anymore. A strong safeguard against industrial air pollutions. This was a legal change which was done very obscurely, no rulemaking, no public announcement. They simply reinterpreted a section of the Clean Air Act, which in effect would allow many facilities to increase their release of hazardous air pollutants, in other words, cancer-causing chemicals, by a very large amount. And so we've mapped that all around the country to look at what those changes would do. In every state, there are such facilities that can now change their classification and no longer have to use best available control technology. Again, not done by regulation, no public comment, nothing, just a legal interpretation. Suppressing a report on the health effects of formaldehyde. I have to say on that one, that report has been suppressed by all of the last 4 administrations, I believe. So they're in bad company or good company there, depending on your point of view. Adding a citizenship question to the census over the objections of what that does to the ability to do an adequate census, which is a statistical issue, and covering up a chemical health assessment for the impacts of something called per or polyfluorinated alkali substances, or PFAS, like at Pease Air Force Base in New Hampshire, where the water table is deeply contaminated with what was used as a firefighting foam. But the White House tried to block release of the report, and we actually used Freedom of Information Act to get the email. The reason was because they thought it would cause a public outcry, which was not a good reason to not release scientific information. So that's some of what we would call attacks on science. It's not a happy picture. If you look at what's happening in federal agencies, I'm not trying to depress you all, I promise, but sorry, it's going to happen anyway. I'm just a gloomy guy. If you look at what's happening in federal agencies, and we have surveyed for the last 3 administrations scientists in federal agencies. The biggest concern that we see in places like the EPA and in the Department of Interior, which is WS's Fish and Wildlife Service, or National Park Service's NPS, it's influence of political appointees in the agency on the scientific work that people are doing. That's the biggest concern, along with absence of leadership who really knows how to manage science programs. Now, I have to say that this is much higher numbers than we've seen in any other administration, but that's always been a concern. It's always a concern that political officials will, it's not an unnatural reaction that you really want the evidence to justify the decision that you want to make. That's not actually startling. It's when you allow that to happen, versus actually saying we have policies in place that don't allow that to happen, and the only recourse shouldn't be a federal judge, that you have the greatest concern. There is influence of the White House, and limited staff capacity is increasingly a problem because you have an awful lot of people leaving federal service. So the people who are in the civil service, they are the professionals in the field. The political appointees, generally at the top of the agencies, they're coming in to bring a political view, bring the administration's view. Every administration does that. In this administration, the professional staff are largely shut out of the policy process to a much greater extent than we've ever seen before. In EPA, and to a large extent at the Department of Interior in particular, and to some extent at Department of Energy, the senior scientists, the other professionals in the agency say they're not even in the room. Their work is not even considered. Doesn't matter what they've been doing. That's a really tough position to be in if that's what your career is. That's what you've dedicated your work to, preventing air pollution or renewable energy standards or whatever it might be, or national parks or endangered species, whatever the work might particularly be. And so you have a lot of people leaving. You also have an aging workforce. So many agencies are being hollowed out, and that's a long-term impact. At the same time, there's been a virtual halt on hiring of new young talent. You know, policy professionals, scientists, it's not just scientists, but actually repopulating those agencies. And agencies always really thrived on having new young talent coming in. And that's really been changed. So they're not mentored by the senior people, and there's very few people who are coming in. And I really worry that the signal to young scientists and young professionals is federal government is not a place where you want to spend any part of your career, and that's a really bad thing for the country. So I am being very depressing, I realize. So I like this picture because I look like a spy. This was from my last John le Carre film. So somebody asked me in an interview, well, can you put into a few words why it matters whether you have science informing public policy? And this was my answer. Basically, if you're not using science as the sideboards, as the guide, you're making wholly political decisions. You know, when Congress makes a decision, they don't have to justify, they have to justify it to the voters in some sense, maybe or maybe not, but they don't have to justify, they don't have to do a scientific analysis, they don't have to take public comment, they don't have to then take it in front of a judge and say, this is why we made the decision that we made. And the judge says, okay, I give you, I will defer to agency expertise or not. Well, if agencies are starting to act like that, that means a huge amount of public policy is made as a wholly political decision, which means whoever has the most influence, that will be the decision. Now, I'm not naive, that's always been the case, that some people have more influence in agencies than others. But if you have to justify it because the law says you do on a scientific basis, that provides some sideboards. It means you can't just decide to release methane on public lands at any level you like. You can't decide that, to move forward on actions on ozone or on particulate matter or on endangered species without justifying it based on the science. So the battle here is, do we want to have our decisions at the agency level made on a wholly political basis? Or should they be guided by science, which is what all of the major laws actually call for and require. So this is my colleague Gretchen Colvin at the March for Science, and either that or the Women's March, I can't remember which one. There were lots of marches that year. And, she is a really, really good young scientist, a young mother, deeply engaged in her work. She's actually an air pollution PhD. And in one of the public hearings that the EPA held, she was on maternity leave. So she came into the public hearing with her newborn. And, I was supposed to be giving a public comment. I gave my usual public comment, and Gretchen walks into the room with a newborn, and I wasn't even in the room. It didn't matter what I said. I mean, she had every single person in every camera talking to her, which was great because she is deeply concerned. What's going to happen to my kids? I'm concerned what happens to my dogs, but that's a different thing. So now let's talk about the National Climate Assessment. I know this is a group of people mostly focusing on climate change, but I wanted you to get a little bit of a broader view of the things that we're seeing happen on climate science are not restricted to climate science. They're across multiple agencies. There are lots of reasons underpinning that, the same as they are for climate change. The tactics are the same, but climate change science is now the poster child for what's happening across far too many fields and too many public policy decisions. The first part of this is, and as we go along, I'm going to refer to some comments that have been made when the National Climate Assessment was released. That's, tried to say, well, we can dismiss that. One of those comments was, well, climate science as a whole is just sort of created so that scientists could make a lot of money, which is really pretty funny. But if it wasn't said, that was actually said on, by people like Rick Santorum on CNN and others in the press. And the reason that I say that in regard to this slide is because we've been doing climate science for a really long time. Studying wave, transfer, fluid dynamics, hydrologic cycle, all for the last 100 years, nearly. We have been looking at aspects of climate change. That changed fundamentally in the 50s and 60s with the measurements of CO2 at the top of Mauna Loa in Hawaii by David Keeling. But that really brought home to people that we were fundamentally changing the climate because we're having a big impact on greenhouse gases. But the idea that this is all some constructed strategy, just from any perspective you look at it, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, all the people I know who are climate modelers could do lots of other things. I'm not a climate modeler. I work on marine resources and marine ecology. But I have to tell you, it's not just people who model the atmosphere or the oceans that are climate scientists in a sense, because if you're working on fisheries, or you're working on marine mammals, or you're working on forestry or wildlife, everything's moving. Everything's responding to a changing climate. So in some sense, anyone who works in the natural world has to be accounting for climate change. So if this was if this was to make money, it was a vast conspiracy where we, even though most scientists don't like each other, and we argue, you get two scientists in a room, you have at least 5 opinions. And so, people argue all the time, it just doesn't hold water. In addition to the fact that to do something like the National Climate Assessment, that's a secret, you don't get paid. This is what, you usually call your nights and weekends work. Because you actually don't get paid. You get an exciting evening and a Holiday Inn in Crystal City, Virginia sometimes, but you don't actually get paid for the work. So the science has a really long basis, and what does that come to? Well, we know something, we know about global carbon emissions. Another talking point, which actually came from a number of places in the administration, including the president, was they only looked at the most extreme scenario. The scenarios that people looked at are the 3 on the left, which are not the most extreme scenarios, and all took off from the black line or gray line or whatever it is, which is the observed increase in global carbon emissions and the average temperature change. So the assessment looks at a variety of scenarios. Obviously, you can't look at an infinite variety of scenarios. And in many cases, you should say what's the most extreme picture, because that's the one where you should be evaluating risks. What's the risk if this happens? And go down from there. So we do see a dramatic increase. The horizontal line is the 20th century average. We do see a dramatic increase in temperature. We do see a dramatic increase in emissions. You can, I don't think I have it in here, but you can look at a much longer record and you see that this is an unprecedented increase. Anyway, you look at it, and the modeling suggests that in most cases you're going to have a continued increase in temperature that's quite large. This is a very frequent talking point, I hope that's visible, is that, well, yes, the climate is changing, the climate has always been changing, which is not actually true in the timeline for the last several hundred years to the extent that these climate changes are occurring. But we don't know what is causing it. We can't assign it to human impacts. So the top line is the observed. for all natural influences. We see an observed line, but then you see volcanic, solar, and orbital. Those are the sort of natural effects that might change climate, and they all really don't really have much impact on temperature difference from the average. So you can't explain it by the natural cycle kind of thing. Solar are things like sunspots or change in solar radiation. Volcanic, if you spew a lot of ash into the atmosphere, it could cool. Generally, it would cool a planet because it would reflect more sunlight, and orbital changes, which somebody has said, oh no, it's just wobbling in the orbit of the Earth. That explains why the climate is changing. Then you could look at the human influences, which are in the middle graph, which show greenhouse gas increases, all the other human drivers, ozone layer, land cover, aerosols, and so on, and they have some offsetting effects. And if you look at all things together, for all of those effects, human and natural influences, it's going up. Well, it's only going up because of the greenhouse gases. Everything else is either down or pretty flat. So do we know that it's human caused? Yeah, we do. You know, generally when you do science like this, you ask, okay, what explains the observed pattern? Is there any other explanation for the observed pattern? And the answer is no. Sometimes you will hear people say, well, we've had a huge reduction, two cold, incredibly cold years the last 2 years. I think I heard that on one of the cable news channels too. If you look up at the top, you see that little dip at the end? That's that huge reduction because we had 2 cold years at the end. Which apparently, you know, the person who was saying it says, well, the scientists don't account for that. Oh, yeah, actually they did. That's that little tick at the end with a little drop. And of course, the temperature does vary all through the cycle because of the weather changes. Sea level rise, you've seen some sea level rise as observed so far. It doesn't look like very much here, but again, the line is the 20th century average. So you've actually seen a significant rise since 1800. Unfortunately, under any of the scenarios, you see a pretty significant sea level rise, given that so much of our coastal infrastructure is pretty close to sea level. So you don't need to have, you know, the 2.4 meters, which is a lot, to have an impact. We're seeing those impacts now, and it gets quite a bit worse by 2050. For marine species, we're seeing a real move for some species, and it's interesting to see what that pattern is. For Atlantic cod, you don't see very much change, but you see quite a big change for the sort of center of the range in terms of latitude. For lobster, black sea bass, for things like weakfish, and other species like that, there actually are estimates that say many of these species are moving on the order of 70 nautical miles a decade in terms of the center of their range, which is a pretty big move for anybody in this community who's familiar with fisheries at all. That's a huge move. So what does that mean? That means you're trying to manage to a moving target because of the shift north. And the management systems are not designed to do that unless you redesign them to manage for shifting. And that's what's happening in a lot of the management discussions for many species now. We've certainly seen declines for cod biomass for lots of reasons and big increases for black sea bass, but often those are serving different needs, different fishermen, different communities, different markets. So these are really quite significant changes. They have price effect, all kinds of things that happen in coastal communities because of these kinds of changes. The loss of lobsters in southern New England, which has been going on now and observed for at least back until the 90s. The big increase, continued increases of lobster in the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank as the water warms, because the Gulf of Maine is warming more rapidly than most places. In fact, the only place that is warming more rapidly in the US is Alaska, compared to the Gulf of Maine. We, in New England, according to the National Climate Assessment, will see some seasonal changes, and you might think, that's not so bad. It wouldn't matter to me if the last spring freeze was, shifted earlier in the year and the first fall freeze shifted later in the year. Well, it might. How about ticks? How about the growing season for lots of invasives? So, yeah, there may be some reasons why, that's not so bad. We get more warm days in, October, a little harder to tell this year. And, it warms up more quickly in the spring. But there are lots of changes when this occurs, and we've already seen some of those with things like insect infestations, invasive species, both plant and animal, and so on. This assessment actually did a much better job than the third assessment that I was involved in of talking about climate change and human health. Looking at changes, climate drivers, exposure pathways, and health outcomes. Because it's becoming much more clear what those health impacts are, and I don't mean from disasters, I mean the ongoing effects of, I don't mean people hurt in storms or something like that, but from just the ongoing effects of climate change. So this is a modeling done for Rhode Island, not very far away, looking at the number of extreme heat days in Rhode Island, which I think is above 90 degrees is the extreme, as we go forward, up to the present and then what we would expect into the future. And extreme heat days in places like Newburyport, like Massachusetts and Rhode Island have a big impact because they have a big impact in the south. We're not actually expecting that extreme heat. We don't necessarily have the facilities for people who may, particularly for more vulnerable communities. Certainly elderly, certainly poor communities. Don't have the ability to deal with extreme heat in the same way. In some ways, extreme cold, other than the heating costs, is easier to deal with because we're more used to it. We all kind of grew up with that, but not extreme heat. My colleagues at UCS have produced a series of reports on rising sea level and the impacts of chronic flooding. So this isn't storm surge, sorry for your name, but this is about just rising seas and chronic long-term flooding. And the reports are really good, and Erica, I think, who was a member of the group, was one of the lead authors for these. But just some simple numbers. Right now, 91 communities around the country are chronically inundated, which means, I'm going to get the definition wrong, but a certain number of days where they regularly see flooding during the year. In other words, into the city streets, there is flooding just due to high tides. And it's not once during the year, it's multiple times during the year. And that increases to 167 communities that have to adapt to chronic flooding. So I think it's something like, more than once a month kind of flooding through the city streets. And again, vulnerable communities are most impacted because they have the least capability to deal with it, often are in the lowest lying areas, and so on. I didn't happen to have the charts for this area, not a flooding area yet, but there are some in Massachusetts. There are some maps that you might look at sometime. I think Conservation Law Foundation actually has them about what happens with a sea level rise in the city of Boston, and the Back Bay becomes the Back Bay again. The impacts of those things are not just irritating and you have to buy rubber boots every couple of years. They actually have start to have an impact on infrastructure, like traffic delays, due to chronic flooding, just actually slowing down the traffic, causing people to wait in traffic much longer because you're regularly going to flood. I don't know if it's possible to wait in traffic much longer in Boston. That seems incredible to me. But for somebody who commutes from Gloucester to Cambridge, but in many areas, the idea of actually adding that loss of infrastructure in low-lying streets is a huge issue. And of course, it also impacts public transportation. Most of our train lines run through very low-lying areas. A couple of years ago, Actually, it's happened in multiple years. The train that I ride, the Newburyport line, froze up because of sea level rise and then freezing around some of the signals. And so this is going to come unless there are strong efforts at adaptation. Probably don't need to tell people about severe storms, but this is not a hard, complicated piece of science to say that warm air holds more moisture. It also is more energy for storms to spin up. Rising seas, of course, increase storm surge, plus much larger precipitation events. So that doesn't mean that you assign any particular storm or the frequency of storms to climate change, but the intensity has now been clearly linked to climate change. The strategies for coastal adaptation are, you really only have three choices. You defend, which is mostly what we've been doing. You accommodate, which is trying to find ways around changes in the coast. Or you leave. Some communities already have had to leave. Some communities would like to leave but have nowhere to go. That's mostly Alaska Native communities. They just have they don't have the capability to move from what might be villages that have been inhabited for hundreds of thousands of years because of the change of sea ice in many cases. They no longer have the barrier of sea ice to protect the village during storms. Or the shoreline is just eroding away. And so the question is, how do you move an Alaskan village that is going to be destroyed? Do you just let the people go somewhere else? Or is the community actually helped to try to move? Now, just as a quick aside, I don't have a watch, but somebody tell me how much time I have. Is there a clock we can see? Yes, there's.
Quarter of 8.
As a brief aside, I now have a guy named Joel Clement who works with me as a senior fellow at UCS in my program. And Joel was the head of the policy office at the Department of Interior, and he was the guy who was working with those Alaska Native communities on figuring out how they could either be moved or adjust to the ongoing effects of climate change. So he was a senior civil servant, and worked in multiple administrations. Secretary Zinke came in, and on one night he transferred, I think it was 16 senior executives. And Joel was transferred out of that office to, he's a forest ecologist originally, but has worked on climate change in the Arctic for a really long time. And he was transferred to the office that collects royalty payments from oil companies as an accountant. And so, so he quit eventually, and he's actually a whistleblower on the Department of Interior because the changes were, he believes, were illegal. At that same time, of the 16, something like 10 of them were Native Americans who were reassigned, which, there's not that many Native Americans in senior positions in government. We weren't all at Bureau of Indian Affairs, but they were all reassigned, some of them out of Washington. So there was a real desire not to have Joel doing the work that he was doing with Alaska Native communities. They just did not want that work done. And so they moved him. Now he's with us and working at the Kennedy School with John Holden in Cambridge, and speaking out a lot about what's happening in the Department of Interior and what's happening with climate change, and he is now setting up a program working on the impacts of climate change in the Arctic. So he's found a place to do that work, but he should be the guy doing it in the agency that's charged with doing this for the government, because that's where he could have the most impact. Finally, in the National Climate Assessment, the costs of adaptation are actually huge. So in this report, for the first time, they started to put dollar amounts, unfortunately in trillions, with a discount rate of 3%, going forward in time, on what it costs, what we expect the different scenarios to cost the US only with a changing climate, if we adapt and if we don't adapt. And there are some changes, obviously the scenario makes a big difference. But the costs have become enormous. And one thing that should be clear, because it's not specific to climate change, is that if you wait, it doesn't get easier or cheaper. It just doesn't. Certainly doesn't get easier. Now, this week in Poland, where the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is meeting, there's also new analyses that show that things are moving faster than we thought, which has been unfortunately dismissed by the Trump administration. I think it was listening to the news today, the negotiation under the Paris Agreement wanted to say that they welcomed the report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which showed accelerating rate of climate change. The US, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen disagreed with that wording. I didn't think it was Yemen, but Kuwait, that sounds right. Disagreed with that wording, just wanted to say that they noted the report existed, not that they welcomed the report. Because saying you welcome the report means you agree with it. Not paying attention to the evidence just makes it harder to deal with all this stuff. So now that I've been astonishingly depressing for the last, whatever it is, 45 minutes, is there something you can do? And I wouldn't be working where I do if I didn't think you could. I mean, there still is a power of constituency. So there are a lot of forces that are pushing a very strong agenda on climate, on a whole number of issues that I've talked about here, but constituents still have some power if constituents will be engaged. The success of sidelining science depends on the fact that people won't object. So it depends on people not being involved in commenting on, so-called regulatory rollbacks. Let's get rid of the rules on methane. Let's get rid of the rules on formaldehyde. Let's roll back the rules on other air pollutants. Let's, remove information on climate change. It's expecting that people won't speak up. Scientists and people who care about this stuff won't speak up. And I actually think that can change. If you do speak up, it does a couple of different things. First of all, it raises political cost. And most people will say, yeah, but, from Massachusetts, I mean, our elected officials already pretty much are on board with addressing climate or whatever it might be. And you shouldn't let that stop you, because the dynamic on Capitol Hill is that everyone is trying to negotiate a position, even when the parties are fighting. And we should remember that it's not one party that has a lock on denying the science on things like fuel efficiency standards. There are lots of people on both sides of the aisle that have been going along with the car companies for a long time, and other issues. But everyone's trying to make alliances and make arrangements. And so even if you believe that your congressperson or your senator pretty much is going to do things that you agree with, you still need to know that these issues matter to you. They still need to hear that from you. They still need to be able to go into a discussion and say, my constituents care. My constituents wrote to me. My constituents came to see me. My constituents were, making a fuss in a public meeting. Because that's sort of one of the most powerful things on Capitol Hill. We can't sort of let go and say, well, it's all money. Yeah, money matters, but constituency still matters too. Now, in some cases, we actually have defeated attacks on science. I can give you one really quick example. There was something called the Regulatory Accountability Act in the last Congress, which would have set up 100 and something new steps in the regulatory process before you could implement a rule. Wouldn't that be fun? Including one that would say that science advisory panels had to accept public comments, and they had to address every public comment in writing and in a public meeting until there were no more comments. Now, this is a science advisory panel, not the regulatory part of it, where you do have to address all the comments. Anyway, it was basically an endless delay process. So we worked really hard with scientists around the country to use as constituents to call their senators, in this case, and to say that this really didn't make any sense, particularly focusing on what it would do to the science process. Well, Claire McCaskill, who used to be in the Senate, in Missouri, was in a very tough place and was attacked for not supporting this supposedly industry-favored or industry-supported rule, or business-friendly rule. And a whole bunch of scientists then wrote into the local paper saying, no, 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 Senator McCaskill was doing the right thing. And the paper actually backed off. They had originally criticized her heavily, and they backed off because they actually didn't know what they were talking about. And she held her vote. The Regulatory Accountability Act disappeared because they couldn't bring it to the floor. They didn't have the votes. So it actually mattered, even though it was like the top of the list for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the thing that they wanted. So you can actually defeat some of these attacks, and there's been a number of other examples too. The thing that works the best is in-person meetings with constituents. It doesn't mean that everyone has to go and meet with their senator or congressperson, but their staffs. And it's not just once. Well, I went and told them I didn't like that. You need to have more regular contact. And particularly we're encouraging scientists to do that, to serve as a resource on some issues. But the face-to-face matters a lot. So for those of you who have spent any time in Washington on Capitol Hill, or on Beacon Hill for that matter, you will see people walking around all the time, going into their elected official offices, and it'll say, you know, Pork Producers of America on their badges, or they'll just be individuals who are going in to talk to their representatives. I mean, you know, I work for a national organization, but when I went in to see Seth Moulton, they open the door and they say, here's your congressman, because he's my congressman from the district. So it matters that you go in face-to-face. Doesn't mean they're always going to do what you say, but they need to know that people are watching, that people care, that people will speak out. Now, another thing that's really impactful, actually, is a lot of, we're sort of past the age where, you know, you fly in an expert from wherever as the person that you should listen to, and then people are going to buy into that. It's local experts that matter more, and it's local news sources that matter more. It's great to get an article in the Times. Our board members love that. The New York Times is like, you know, the paper of record, but that's not where a lot of people get their news. A lot of people get their news from local news sources. And so writing local op-eds and letters to the editor has just as much impact, sometimes more impact, than big national outlets. And sorry, that, I gotta go back. This was, you know, we're doing training sessions with young scientists around the country on how to get into the political debate, because that's not something they teach you in graduate school. In fact, they teach you mostly the opposite. And so we're doing continual training sessions with what we call science watchdogs around the countries in key states. And no, they're not in Massachusetts. They're in places like Missouri and Montana and Indiana and Nevada, because those are going to be the swing states in a lot of these votes. I'm going to skip through the next one, except to say that in the lead up to midterm election, we had created a program called Science Rising. Not actually sure whether people would be interested in being engaged around the midterms. It was a coalition of, we ended up having 169 events around the country, of people trying to talk about science in their local election setting, a whole lot of online impressions from something called tweet chats, and please nobody ask me what the hell a tweet chat is, because I don't know. But people who work with me who are, you know, all in their 20s and 30s, they know what that means, and it seems to work. With, you know, 175 partners, organizing partners or official partners. We even had art projects, including one in Portland, Maine, which was really cool if you didn't see it. You can see it on the Science Rising website. So now, what has to happen? Well, our government is actually designed to have checks and balances. which we all learned in middle school or whatever, with Congress as an independent branch of government, providing a check on the executive, the courts providing a check on both. But that checks and balances, the courts part of it has worked to some extent, but there has been no congressional oversight for 2 years to a large extent. I mean, some members have been trying. I've never actually seen an administration where they decided they would not respond to letters from the minority party. So if an agency, if you wrote to NOAA Fisheries and you were not from the majority party, then the agency did not feel bound by administration policy to respond. It means you're only responding to half the country. The EPA actually didn't respond. NOAA probably did. I don't know. But the EPA actually refused to respond to the other party. That's not the way the system of government works. In fact, the American system of government doesn't work when you don't have an independent Congress. It doesn't, we don't have a parliamentary system. It doesn't function. We can use the courts, but we need Congress to reinstitute oversight. That means they need to question agencies. Why did you do this? We want the information. We have the power of the purse, all of the things that are most irritating when you're a senior government official because you're continually being yelled at. Actually, you're supposed to be. That's how the system works. And to do that, there is a critical role for constituents to tell our elected officials that that's what we expect, that's what we want, that we care about issues. Because, yeah, you can hope they're going to do it anyway. Yes, they care. But remember, every time they go into a meeting, if they can say, my constituents really care about this, I just heard from my constituents, or I heard from whoever last week about why this is impacting their community, that's a more powerful argument. It always will be. So I'll leave you with this. It is actually important on climate to focus on the role of science, but it's not just climate. It is important to take action quickly, and we actually have 2 years, and it's not going to be a very nice 2 years, to try to institute a functioning government between Congress and the administration with all of the challenges that go along with that. But I think it's possible. I think it's hard. I really can't handle more than about 10 issues a week to respond to. But I do encourage you to try to speak out and to be involved and not to just hope that somebody's going to take care of this, because right now it's not being taken care of. Thank you. A little over time with this, but time for questions. If there are any. Unless I put everybody to sleep. Yes, please.
Yes, Chaffee Manelli, Innsbury. I'm looking at the person-to-person issue going on here. I have visited Prager University, which is a Facebook propaganda mill by the religious right, and there's a lot of climate change denial amongst other things. And having people being able to counter some of those pretty tricky arguments that they put up there. I mean, they get some experts up there who may be 1 in 100, but if you're not knowledgeable, you can't really refute them, and then they're just getting all the more confirmed. So I would be interested in recommended debates that are better to show, not this one climate change denier against Bill Nye the Science Guy, which I'm sure you're aware of.
Yeah.
That was a very poorly set up debate.
Yeah.
And so that we can have links to information that we can get online, and we can actually debate people with some facts.
Yeah. So it's a fair point. There's a lot of stuff out there that is more than just the criticism of the National Climate Assessment that I mentioned, that is just nonsense. There's actually two schools of thought. One is, we should be responding to all of these things, which is in some ways feeding into the tactic of let's divert everybody's energy to responding to nonsense as opposed to doing the work that we climate scientists, not me, I guess, should be doing. And there's quite a few resources out there. We have some on our webpage on the facts about climate change. In the National Climate Assessment, after the National Climate Assessment, a woman named Catherine Hayhoe from Texas did a fairly long piece on Twitter as well as I think on Facebook that was debunking a lot of the criticisms that were raised. She's a really outstanding climate scientist. She also happens to be evangelical Christian, so she spends a lot of time talking to evangelical groups about climate change. So there are some resources there, but it is a design tactic to say, the climate scientist can't answer this. And, to a question that's been answered thousands and thousands of times before. And most people have just said, let's talk about what we know, not continually respond to negative attacks. And it's hard to know whether that's the right strategy or not. What you do see is a shift in the so-called denialist strategy. This isn't happening at all. Now it is, when we don't know what it's due to, we can't assign it to, human impacts. The other one I've actually heard directly from the now administrator of the EPA, Andrew Wheeler, is, well, even if it is happening, we don't have the authority of the Clean Air Act to address it, even though the Supreme Court has said we do. So we're going to see that shifting set of tactics and a lot of misinformation. In some sense, it would be nice to just say, okay, if you want to believe that, go ahead, but everybody else has moved on. Tony?
So I'm interested in local solutions to a degree. Newburyport banned plastic bags, Haverhill's banned plastic bags. Watertown just made a zoning change to set every building over 10,000 square feet has to go solar. Local places are doing things, and we've got 2 years to figure out what's going to happen, there. But what's a good set of strategies that locally we can encourage?
So certainly, the local actions are incredibly important, and they need to be focusing on, what are we going to do to adapt and defend or adjust to a changing coastal environment, particularly for coast. Those changes are not just from sea level rise. It's also we're going to see a changing rainfall pattern, and the estimates are much heavier rain events, precipitation events overall in the Northeast, much more drought in the Southwest. Those predictions were there some time ago and have turned out to be pretty accurate, and we're seeing it increase. So I think serious discussions about what happens to the Newburyport waterfront, what happens to infrastructure for people commuting into the city, are really important. The reason the federal role is important is, one, money, but also because you need that framework for things like modernizing the grid, so that when you have increased renewables, you actually can use the energy in an effective way. Changing the transportation system and really encouraging a shift to low carbon. It doesn't mean everybody's going to give up their cars. It's not the scare tactic that you keep hearing. It's that we adjust to a system that actually doesn't do the damage that we're doing. Electrification for transportation, for trucks, as well as for passenger vehicles, is possible. But it needs a federal push, the same as the car industry needed a federal push, and so we have the interstate highway system. Those things are really important to the local. So I agree, there's lots happening at a local level, but it just isn't going to be enough unless you get a more coherent regional strategy. UCS is working on a regional transportation strategy that would mirror sort of the electricity generation strategy in the so-called regional greenhouse gas initiative, to have a transportation strategy that does the same thing, to try to incentivize cleaner transportation. It's gonna need local communities to buy in and say, yeah, that we want that for Newburyport, and we want it for, our commuters want it getting into Boston or wherever the biggest impacts are. Yep.
Would you say some of that regional strategy needs to be developed around bioregions in particular too? I mean, watershed.
It does, particularly for watersheds, because we're gonna have a changing water pattern, as we're already seeing with changing precipitation. We also, because of the storm events, have, different or increasing problems, of course, with, even though we made a lot of progress on stormwater and sewage. So, yeah, it would be good to have a bioregion, but at this point, I'll take it any region. I mean, we are so desperately in need to catch up. And, I mean, frankly, one of the most, I don't know if it's the most disturbing thing, because there's lots of disturbing things that go on. For, we basically abdicated international leadership role on all these issues. And that's really hard to watch, because we have just abdicated that role on so many different areas. We've, abdicated a role in the Arctic. We've abdicated our role in Paris Climate Accord on a lot of contamination and pollutants and so on. The U.S. just isn't there. I went, one of the things that I work on is ocean conservation. And I went to the first negotiation session on, we're called the High Seas Biodiversity Conservation outside of national 200-mile limits. And, I mean, there was a U.S. delegation there, and, whenever they got the microphone, everybody found something else to do, because they just really were not respected in the room, because they went into the meeting with no instruction. They weren't stating really anything that you could consider as a leadership role, and that's happening in too many places. The opportunity to do things with clean energy, with, decarbonizing our industrial process, our transportation process, is huge. But somebody is going to take that leadership role, and it should be us.
Yeah.
Back after this, go ahead.
Yeah, it seems there's something more fundamental than just science ignorance, because there are people that absolutely know and believe what's happening with global warming, but they still wouldn't be willing to make any kind of a drastic change. Whether it's $2, $3, $4, $5 trillion, the real question is, who's going to actually pay for that, and how is it going to get distributed? I mean, you can see in France, the average person is saying, no, you're not going to put that cost on me alone. I mean, we have elites who go around preaching climate change and what a great emergency it is in their 727s, 737s. We got people with homes in Aspen and the Caribbean, New York, London. They don't seem to be willing to give up anything, even if they believe in climate change. So why is the average Joe going to do anything when, as an individual, you making a sacrifice has absolutely no impact? In fact, this whole state could make a sacrifice to mitigate climate change. Wouldn't do anything. It's got to be global, and there's no leadership, as I see it, to do that.
Well, I wouldn't agree with you that it doesn't make any difference even if the whole state did it or individuals do it, because you can say, well, okay, unless we've actually changed CO2 emissions globally, it doesn't make any difference, so we're just going to wait for everybody else to do it. But that's not a particularly useful strategy. It does matter if you have leadership from a state like Massachusetts, which has enormous resources.
I'm not saying you shouldn't do it.
No,
How
I
do you
understand.
persuade someone to do it?
I think two things about this. First of all, there does need to be a push from the citizenry that says, help us figure this out. Yeah, individuals are not going to, I'm not suggesting that everyone go live in a log cabin off the grid. That's not the solution to this problem. Same as I just said, I'm not suggesting everybody give up their car. It is a national challenge. I don't accept that the US shouldn't do anything until every other country does. Is that what we've done in the past? No, it's not what we've done in the past. And so I do think that there are some real opportunities to lead. I think also we have a republic for a reason. People need to make hard decisions. It's, you know, that is so difficult in today's political climate, but unless we get back to making hard decisions that are, for some, extremely unpopular, we will not solve major societal challenges, including climate change and many, many others, education, you know, a whole set of issues around inequity and so on. And so I actually believe that, yes, citizenry needs to push, but then that push is to make some of those hard decisions. Now, what's happening in France, we might disagree with the causes of that. The proximate cause, of course, was an increase in gas taxes, but it was a much more fundamental change in the governmental battle there that I think led to those protests. Yes, ma'am, you really want to say something, please?
Ellen Kennedy, Newbury. Thank you, Storm Surge, for again bringing us these incredible programs. I just returned from the Parliament of World Religions in Toronto, and if anybody wants to know anything about it, you can go online, but 6,000 international attendees, 500 presentees, and the major topic, of course, was the climate crisis. And I did David Corton's track, founder of Yes Magazine, and he had invited philosophers, theologians, as well as scientists to speak. I was there during the US election. It was very difficult to be from the United States in an international community. But what they were telling us, and you know, it's heart-stopping, it's gasping, that it will take 300 years for us even to begin to stop what's happened in the past 100 years. And a millennium to come anywhere near where we were before it began. And I would love your opinion on that. And that it's a climate crisis, but we're in an existential crisis. And the young people, the young woman who spoke at the G20 from, I think she was from Switzerland or Austria, she said, I'm here, I'm not asking for anything, I'm telling you to get out of the way, because we're coming.
She's from
So
Sweden.
I love,
She's from Sweden.
Sweden, yeah, so I love what you're saying about the young people, you know, in your organization, but can you speak on that? And one of the presenters at the Storm Surge, the man from the aquarium, I loved what he said. He said, we don't have time for elevator speeches anymore. We need laser points. So I'm looking for a couple of laser points.
So,
Thank you.
well, thank you. So I do think that this will be led by young people ultimately. I think it's not helpful to say we need to get back to an earlier state. We're going to be in a different state of nature and a different state of society, one way or the other.
Those
But
are
we
my
do-
words. I did not paraphrase.
But we do need to address those coming challenges, and one of the ways to address the coming challenges is by reducing emissions so that they're not as extreme. Because it's very hard to make change as fast as we need to if you just do nothing about emissions. But you know, to say that it's going to take hundreds or thousands of years to go back to where we were, well, we haven't done that on anything. We haven't done it on land use, we haven't done it on, you know, water use or anything else. But we do actually need to figure out how do we address this challenge other than by denying it is occurring. And I do think that, you know, even though I think that there's very vague and confusing talk about things like a new Green Deal, a Green New Deal, can't even get the words right, because nobody actually knows what that means. The idea that we need to take on a huge societal challenge again, like the Great Depression was a big societal challenge, is correct. I don't know what that consists of exactly, but there's some pretty good ideas out there about what it consists of. Building a modern grid would be one of those things. Building, you know, the capability for electrified transportation will be another. You know, in many places, like in California now, they're producing more renewable energy than they can use. They just have enough don't have either a storage system or a metering system that actually works to use that. But they're producing more than they could use for the state of California, which is pretty big. Yes, sir.
Yes, I think British Columbia actually instituted a non-revenue generating carbon tax. And they reduced carbon emissions by 5%. Their economy grew by 15%, and they're doing very well with it. So things don't have to be like in France, that there are ways of implementing strategies that are successful and don't require sacrifice. And I think that those are the kinds of things the state of Massachusetts should be doing in order to move the country forward, move our state forward, because everybody will benefit from it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that, first of all, we don't want California leading anymore. I do think that there are models like that that can work. And there are others in other countries. The US isn't very good at adopting models from other countries, particularly since most countries have a different tax system. But there's a lot to be learned. I think we can, it will have to come from the states at this point. It's not going to be a national program. In fact, I don't, there are real questions about now, strategically, about whether you should even try for, a climate change bill on Capitol Hill in the next, not in the next 2 years, but beyond that. Or let things happen on a more piecemeal basis or from the states. And that's a serious political strategy question, because it may just not be possible, and we can't afford to have another failure that sets us back to where we were, again at the beginning of the administration. Let me go over here, because I've been asking on this side, sir.
Scientists are wonderful in not going beyond the facts that they have to speak about. However, when we fail to look beyond 2100, aren't we shooting ourselves in the foot by not recognizing the true magnitude of what will occur if we do not change in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years? If we continue as we are, we face a much greater tragedy than is shown in those graphs that somehow end at 2100. That's the end of the story. Not the end of the story. Scientists could go out on a limb and talk about what happens if we continue to keep our feet in the sand and not do anything.
So those projections beyond 2100 exist. This is one of those things where you can't win. If you go beyond 2100, people say, 2100? Give me a break, I'll be lucky to make it till next week. But if you don't go beyond 2100, people say, well, we don't know what the end point is. Well, that's because the end point isn't very clear at this point. And of course, the projections get less certain the further out you go, which raises different opportunities for people to poke holes in them. So there's been a strong move in terms of the big consensus reports like the National Climate Assessment to focus on the fact that these are not long-term projections, these are observations. We actually know this has happened. So we're not saying sometime in the future something's going to happen, we think. We're saying this happened and this is the consequences of that happening, and then taking it out to 2100. That's a strategy question which may be misplaced, but I don't think it's a matter of people unwilling to do the projections. It's just you're trying to get an audience. Remember, most of these climate scientists talk about going out on a limb. They've been out on a limb with a saw in their hand for quite a while now. Some of them, have had really, including Catherine Pale and Michael Mann and others, are having a tough time. They're just deluged with all kinds of abuse because they, speak about the work that they do. So I think that they're pretty bold, and the projections exist, but there is a serious strategy question about whether it's worth going farther out beyond people's view.
I
You want to
I
respond
should have
quickly?
added one more reason for my point, which is that we humans respond much better to a crisis than ecological.
Well, totally true, yes, sir.
On a note of optimism, although a young lady brought out a thing that says that nothing can happen for 1,000 years. In about 1970, my wife and I drove from this coast to the west coast, got to LA. You couldn't see across the street. There's a thing called smog. You couldn't breathe well and people wore masks. Because of the Clean Air Act, it's gone. Now much of it's moved to Beijing because they still burn coal. Here's my question. How did about half the country, some would say, one particular party, but everybody, get so stupid so fast? Is there a cure for that?
I ask myself that question almost every day. So I don't have a good answer for you. In fact, this is true story. The person who is heading the Science Advisory Board for the Environmental Protection Agency, which manages the Clean Air Act, has actually been quoted as saying, actually modern air is too clean to be healthy.
Oh my gosh.
Of course, he's been working for the oil industry for a long time. Let's go back over here, sir.
My impression is, we've got some major players out there that are absolutely against it, and you're talking about, the bottom line on that is profitability. You've got industry, you've got individuals, and as much as people come forward, they have a whole organization to counter it and so forth. They could care less about tomorrow as long as the bank account today is getting bigger.
Yeah, there's no question of that, and I'm probably not here to say, that we should make a change from the capitalist system, but but think about that. They poured a lot of money into certain political changes, and still, some people pushed through in this last election against that money. Some didn't win, but they still pushed pretty hard against extraordinary odds that didn't have that money behind them. So I still think there's a chance, even with those resources. Partly because they don't always get it right, and partly because people aren't buying it.
I think we'll take one more question because we're running out of time.
Yeah?
Yes, I keep hearing that the auto companies now are going to build more bigger cars now. They're not going to bother with small cars. We've got lower gas prices. They're going to buy bigger, and they're doing it. I mean, surrounded by all these big cars. I think that's the thing that has to be careful not to get run over. But there aren't going to be. I mean, that just doesn't help, and we're just going backwards.
Yeah, I mean, so car companies are playing an interesting game of saying that they agreed to increase fuel efficiency standards, but then with the new administration saying, no, only kidding. We actually want you to roll it back because we'll do it voluntarily, and now closing down some US plants for some of the smaller vehicles and electric vehicles. Some of this is going to be driven actually by the demand for electric vehicles in other places, like China and India. But it is unfortunate that they've been able to sell the idea that it's all a matter of freedom and choice, that that's what everybody wants. Well, if that argument was true, then they don't need to advertise, and I don't think car companies advertise very much, do they? Again, that's very profitable. Those cars are extremely profitable. It works out really well for the oil industry. Gas prices are very low, but this is why individual action actually does matter in some cases. It's fun to ride around in a big four-wheel drive, but it's usually unnecessary. Some people need it, but most. I mean, those who carry their horses in the back seat obviously need a Chevy Suburban, but beyond that. So, you know, there needs to be some pushback, again, you know, on that sort of corporate narrative, but it's very hard to do. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenberg. That was a great talk, and I appreciate everybody coming. Now, just to kind of wrap up, along the lines of what can you do personally, aside from being a constituent and voicing your concern, I mean, what we're talking about is social change here. So, you know, climate change and working against it needs to become sort of the societal norm, and so you need to lead by example. So I just want to see a raise of hands, because I think we've got pretty much a choir situation here, where we're kind of all on the same page, but I want to see where the choir might be relative to, for example, how many people have assessed their own carbon footprint. So maybe a third, a little bit more. So, I mean, that's a great place to start. I mean, there are things online. I think EPA has a calculator. You can go on and you can put in how many cars you have, how, you know, what is their miles per gallon, how far do you drive in a given year, how many LED bulbs do you have in your house, do you have solar panels, and so on and so forth. And you can actually look at how much of a footprint you're making yourself. And I mean, I did it personally, probably because I'm involved in this, right? But I did it and figured out, hey, you know what? Solar panels on the house, one electric car. I cut my carbon footprint in half just by those two things. And at the time, there were some incentives to buy solar panels in an electric car, and it actually mathematically worked out cheaper to buy those two components together than to purchase a used gas-powered car for my wife. So if you're not looking at what you're doing yourself, you can't make that rub off on your neighbors. So, you know, I've got solar panels and an electric car. Well, all my neighbors see that, I have that. And they ask me, how's that working out for you? And I explain to them why I did it and how it's working. So that's just one example. If you can look at what you're doing personally and have that rub off on people close to you, and get them to maybe look at what they're doing, then as a society, we start to change our behavior and what we do. And it's a lot of local stuff, you know. Transportation is kind of an issue for me because I own a car repair business, and I'm tuned into cars and driving and a lot of the alternative technologies that are out there. But one of the things that's fairly simple is our roads. Bumpy roads consume energy. When you start compressing suspensions, you're using energy that used to be part of momentum moving the car forward. So smooth roads aren't a luxury. It's really a necessity if you want an efficient vehicle. The other big thing, and it's my own pet peeve, are traffic lights that are stupid. Stopping 20 cars to let one car make a left-hand turn. So you got 20 cars starting from zero and accelerating when they're getting the highest emissions and using the most fuel. We have the computer technology to know how many cars are within a certain grid coming down towards a light, and that light should be able to make a decision. Oh, 20 cars coming. Let that other car wait 5 more seconds till they pass, then change the light. It's that sort of stuff that we're not, you know, dealing with at all. These are there are millions of cars on the road, and they're all, you know, driving around inefficiently, and there are great scales of efficiency that can be achieved. But anyway, it's running late, and I want to let you go. And I appreciate you all coming out tonight, and look for our programs coming up in the spring.